But we're here with Amber Case, a kind of a favorite speaker and fi- member of the Street Fight family, I think. And I wanted to talk a little bit today. Amber currently works at Esri, and a lot of her work over the past decade has been kind of at the philosophical intersection of data and places, both in kind of what it means to improve human lives and kind of for privacy and the way we live. And so could you talk a little bit about like kind of where your interest in kind of place technology and data generally came from?
Sure.
No?
Check. Great. So when I was in college, I was really obsessed with the kind of future of the interface. I wrote my thesis on cell phones and their techno-social sites of engagement. The iPhone really hadn't come out yet. It was very, very new. And I walked around San Francisco and just watched people on their phones. And I was noticing this kind of evolutionary trend where we had these physical buttons that, if you wanted to change what they did, you had to physically rewire the machine. And then suddenly with the smartphone, the screen dissolved and the interface became liquid, and a button could be anywhere on the screen at any time. And so you could change that just with software. I said, if it goes solid to liquid, the next thing must be air, right? So how do you make a button in the middle of the air? And I was researching the idea of if you have ambient location on your device, you could basically just walk into a button. And this is, of course, the idea of the geofence, which wasn't popularized in just consumer applications yet. That was something that was relegated to the Garmin field. So later I started this company called Geoloki, which really ended up being passive location and geofencing without significant battery drain, because that was the thing that got into the way. And the other thing that got in the way was privacy. And so we tried to solve those problems. We eventually got bought by Esri a couple years ago. So my interest has always been where do you go in terms of making the interface get out of the way and just giving you the data when you need it, where location becomes a filter, and then that gives you the context for the information that you're getting. Instead of having to look at your phone all the time, you get more serendipity.
Meaning like stuff like, from the Internet of Things and kind of getting alerts from your refrigerator and that kind of thing, or?
Yeah, well, the issue with the alerts from your refrigerators, do you really need alerts from your refrigerator? Like, for instance, if you have bananas out on the counter, they have evolved to show you that they're not ripe anymore, right? They turn brown. So you don't need to have a smart chip that gives you an alert on your phone and your smartwatch and your Google Glass and everything that tells you that it's time to refresh something. And I think some of those are really great in like the healthcare industry, where you have a fridge that needs to tell you some information about like when to take medicine or something like that. But I think there's been a lot of over-design in the Internet of Things, where we're making technology that we don't necessarily need, that isn't necessarily solving a problem. And so I'm trying to look at that. I have these slides called like the dystopian kitchen of the future, in which you've got 20 different companies building alerts in like 20 different programming languages that don't connect with each other. And then you have like, sorry, we have to download this new virus update in order for you to open your fridge, right? Maybe somebody's having a diabetic attack and they need to like get something out of their fridge, and they're like ending up. I mean, I like to look at the edge cases of when things go wrong. So I've definitely been looking at that. But I did used to have a house that had a geofence around it. And when my phone went into the geofence, when I got home, the lights would automatically turn on in the house, and it would say, hey, welcome home, right? Is that necessary at all? Maybe. It was a fun thing to do. But there are situations in which it could go wrong too. So it's really important to think, what's the least amount of technology you can build into something? Because the more features and more tech you build into something, the more features you have to support, the more assembly line you have to figure out, the more onboarding and user training you have to do, and there's more issues for that to go wrong. So with calm technology design, you want to design all of that out in the beginning so that you have the least amount of features, the least amount of support, where like a little bit of location goes a long way.
But how do you know what the right alerts are how do you create filters that are smart enough to know what you want to know and what you don't want to know?
You have to take it out into the real world and test it with different types of people. And that's the hardest thing, because a lot of people will say, I'm going to test this in a user experience laboratory, right? Where somebody's under like a fluorescent light, and they have some cookies and some coffee, and there's some forms to film out, and maybe they're getting paid $25, right? So they're in the most opportune environment for testing, where everything might go right. But really, you need to like test it on somebody in a supermarket checkout line. Can you download my app in under 3 minutes? Can you use it? Can you onboard yourself? And can you not get frustrated? And then watch where they get frustrated. Watch what happens in the edge case when it goes wrong. Watch somebody try to, hook up their television when there's an Xbox and a Dreamcast and like 20 other like retro devices that are hooked up to the TV, and they just want to watch television, right? So those are the edge cases to try and design around. Also, like when people are sending all these location-based alerts, it's just maybe you only need one per day. Maybe you only need 2 per day, the relevant ones. And you have to really get out there and test with people to see what works.
See what they think is relevant. Or
Yeah.
And so does everybody have to have kind of a personalized device that knows the degree to which they want to receive alerts?
Well, a lot of it is giving people choice, right? So in terms of privacy, people will give up a lot of privacy if they're getting something in return that's better than what they gave up, right? It's always the social contract. So at the beginning or at the point in which you're having somebody share content, you need to tell them exactly what they're getting in return, and then they'll be much more likely to say, okay, I'll share that because I know where the information is going, how long it'll be used for, the limits of what my privacy data is, my private data is going to be used for. And as long as you say that up front and you give them that information, it makes it easier. Of course, we see the opposite with Facebook, which is this is so convenient that you can't fall back to what would you do before, like a phone call or like a snail mail, right? So people are kind of putting up with privacy violations and kind of social experimentation. And that's a big issue, right? Because on the one hand, you have convenience. On the other hand, you have a lot of privacy issues.
Do you think people are aware to the degree to which their privacy is compromised by something like Facebook? Because Facebook is sort of notorious for changing the rules as you go along, and then expecting you to read lots of text to know what that means.
I think it's always going to be a spectrum. No matter what, there's always going to be a group of people, no matter what the technology is, that don't understand the ramifications of their personal data being shared, right? So in the last era, we saw junk mail, right? Every time you get junk mail, it's a privacy violation. But you don't open up your mailbox and say, junk mail, privacy violation, and call FTC or whatever, because that's just a norm. That's what we're used to, right? So now you have, let's say, 14-year-olds who are just posting everything on Facebook, not understanding that they have kind of a second self, this online persona that they can craft and they can limit, right? They're just being themselves online without any understanding that this might have more viewers than they originally thought. So we kind of have people going through a second adolescence trying to figure that out. Lots of people being awkward around that, right? So
around the stuff they've shared in the past and then having to kind of deal with it?
Right, that you have this kind of digital, like, paleontological record that, can be dug through at any moment in time, and that, there are dinosaurs that can come back to get you at that point. But I think what we see is if there's a big privacy violation, that's the time when there's these kind of Titanic scenarios that things get fixed, that we can call into question what's happening and actually do new policies. But if it's like the slow, the analogy of like the frog in the pot of boiling water, if it's slow like that, there's never enough excitement around an issue that's normally very boring to get these things changed, right? So it's usually these like big hot button scenarios that push forward the policy. But if we never get to those hot button scenarios, then we don't get the change that we need until it's too late.
So at Esri, you've been putting together kind of lots of different types of data from, to make APIs and products for a wide variety of kind of end users, both from institutions to apps to individuals. So what are some of the issues you come across when you're stitching together different data sets? And I mean, location, but also just kind of other kinds of data.
When we were building the startup Geoloki, we wanted to make a system that allowed you to subscribe to location-based data. We had this concept of layers, and you could walk around and get the Wikipedia layer, which was all the Wikipedia articles around you so that you wouldn't have to look at Wikipedia, or pinball machines around you, or interesting events around you, or crisis information, or disaster information, or all these different things around you that would be interesting. And we built the first part, which is let's subscribe to local data. And then when we tried to find location-based data, it was a mess, right? We tried to go to different providers. We tried to import databases of Foursquare venues, and we even had a bunch of partners to do this with. But at the end of the day, the data was messy, right? You can either make a subscription system to location data, or you can make a publishing system. And people haven't really built a publishing system, right? So you get these databases that are weird file formats. They're not really cleaned up. Even Portland, Oregon's government made this civic apps database, which had heritage trees and TriMet location information. It was really neat, but the data often was stored in PDFs, or like there was an API, but it was SOAP based instead of REST based. So it was more, when we were going to hackathons and things like that, people were spending 4, 5, 6 hours just configuring one data set. And this is the real sad part of a social interface like Twitter. Early on, before it came a social interface, I thought that it was going to be the backbone for the Internet of Things, because you could choose anything you wanted and hook it up to Twitter and have it have a data feed and also attach location to it. So what you could have done is said, hey, here's what's happening at, or here's this object in reality, and now it has a feed, and now you can subscribe to it without being a programmer. So I think the big issue is, like we saw with Adobe coming out and Photoshop and all these tools in like the last .com boom decade, is things got really big because people didn't have to be developers to use it. You didn't have to be a developer to get some poster done, right? Even though it was probably really crappy looking.
Yeah.
And today you have to be a developer to clean up the data, put it into an interface. You have to understand what an API is. And we shouldn't have to be doing any of that. It should be Lego blocks. Okay, I want this thing over here and this thing over here, and now here's an output, right? We kind of saw that with Yahoo Pipes and a lot of the Yahoo initiatives in 2006, 2007, 2008. But then when Twitter became not developer friendly, you couldn't do that anymore. And that was really an amazing space where people could do this. Now we have if this then that, but it's not really accessible to everybody because it's still based on the idea of an API. It's stitching data together. So I think we have to wait, maybe another 5 years or the next generation of the web where we can actually take that data and there's an incentive to put it into not necessarily one standard, but there are ways for it not to speak all these different languages. I think we have kind of a Tower of Babel of different data sets right now where we all want to be able to read stuff in the same language, but we can't. And now we're being divided by all the little proprietary data formats and walled gardens. And that's making the industries compete against each other. And we see this a lot in the geo industry where all the different startups are competing and they're not using the best of each industry. And so you see the whole industry not fulfilling its goal of helping users and helping customers. They're just infighting. And this is really frustrating to me because I think that the next change is people will find that there's more opportunity in working with each other. Like, for instance, hardware providers are really great at hardware. Software developers are great at software. You do not often find a company that's good at hardware and software. It's two different mindsets, right? So the people that do hardware should have a responsibility to the software developers to make a good API, right? You see that with Philips. Good hardware, good API. And then the software developers say, we don't like your native apps. They're not very good. You didn't really make a great effort in making this good. But you have a good API, we can make it better, right? And then they can make money off of the software part. Hardware providers can make money off the hardware part. But right now we have people trying to do the whole thing. We're going to do software and hardware, and we're going to do this and this and this and this. And then at the end of the day, no one works on battery life, and everyone buys quantified self devices, and they don't charge them, and then they just sit there on their desk because a lot of us have extra money to buy the quantified self devices because they're fun and they're cheap, and then we don't use them because they're stuck in this data silo of, great, I know how well I slept last night, but I don't know how to connect that to how many steps I walked or when I ate. I'm not getting any recommendations that if I sleep 1 more hour tonight and start at 8 p.m., I won't get that period of doom from 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. where I'm tired, where in America you don't get to like take a nap because we're like a work ethic culture and we don't take a tea break, right? So there's these things where we don't really get any perspective and we can't see our data. We just have these like little tiny silos of, oh, it's cool, I'm getting data in, but I can't do anything with that data. And so you have people disincentivized to continue to use these devices and really make meaning.
Does that sort of encourage more of them to do things like Google Glass, for instance, to become like kind of a fad that, 10 years from now we'll just remember, oh, that was an interesting thing that they did?
Google Glass had a great opportunity if they launched like the iPhone did. Because the iPhone was originally this little tiny iPod without a screen. Then it was an iPod with a screen. Then it was a thing that was a whole screen, right, without any buttons. And then it became, hey, now there's access to a network, and now it's a phone, and it was crappy, and it cost $600, and everybody tested it. And then it was, now there's apps. Okay, it's still not very good, but everybody can make apps in it if they pay $99. So over the course of 10 years, you saw small features being onboarded, it being tested in the real world, and people not freaking out that everybody has smartphone cameras in their pockets, right? You read the articles from 2000, everyone was terrified of smartphones in their pockets. Everyone has one in this room, and it's not a big deal because it got blended into social norms. When you do product design and you don't understand social norms, you don't understand that, like, when the first elevator came out, it had to be artificially slowed down because people's eardrums were hurting, then you design in this perfect future world that doesn't exist yet. You have to like lead people into the future slowly and explain what a thing does, and then they'll meet you there. But with the Google Glass, it's $1,500. No one can develop with it until you pay $1,500. You can't play with it. I mean, you saw all these people playing, 13-year-olds making a whoopee cushion app. Well, like, that's the killer app as a whoopee cushion, right? That got everybody to develop. Well, you put ads on it, and suddenly, like, you can make $1,000 a month, Like, my first iPhone app paid for my iPhone. I didn't even have an iPhone yet. I didn't have to have one before I built an app. There was a simulator, there's developer tools. So with Google Glass, it was, here's all the features. We're not going to tell you what each feature is. What it could have been is, here's a little thing without a camera. You can get driving directions on, in your car. 2 years later, now you can do this thing. Now you can do this thing. And then everyone would have said, we know what this is. It does one thing. Now it does two things, but we've had a year or two to understand what these things are. Slow, 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 slow. And you get it into the environment. So that was the big mistake. And of course, it will set back that industry a while, too. So I guess I keep seeing these things happen. It's like, oh, but it was already figured out at Xerox PARC 30, 40 years ago. But oftentimes people just think that because technology is technology, everybody will accept it. And in some countries, like having a lot of features is tied to your social status, so it's okay. Like in South Korea, if you have a washing machine with a lot of features on it, that's a status symbol. You don't want to hide that, right? Whereas in America, you have people buying mid-century modern devices because they're simple. It's like the height of design. There's not much. It works for a long time. It's aesthetically pleasing, right?
Cool. So we only have a couple minutes left. You're, I don't know if this breaks news or whatever, but you are leaving Esri soon, and so could you maybe talk a little bit about kind of where you're going and what you're thinking about?
Sure. So I'm going to leave Esri R&D Center Portland. I'm the director of the R&D Center there, and I've been there since we sold our company. It's been really incredible to work with a larger company, and we built a developer site. It's got like 1 million visitors a month. We built a bunch of other products that like are doing pretty well. Had a great team, but it's time for me to move on. So I'll be leaving on Monday, and I'll be writing. First thing I'm going to do is write a book for O'Reilly called Calm Technology.
Cool.
Which is all about designing for the Internet of Things, where the limited resource we'll have is attention. So how you design alerts and how you design products becomes really important. So it's going to be kind of a boring text manual on here's different alert styles that don't require all of your attention, just some of it, and only when necessary, so that the technology is kind of invisible, gets out of your way, speaks when it needs to be heard, and doesn't otherwise. And then I'll be working on a project with Chris Dancy, actually, who I met in 2012 at this little unconference that I hold called Cyborg Camp, which is on the future of humans and technology. And we'll be making use of lots and lots of data to do really interesting predictive things. Like, for instance, a lot of people have open office plans and one person gets sick and then everybody gets sick. Wouldn't it be nice to know if one person is about to get sick based on their behavior and then tell them don't come in the office because you're going to get 8 other people sick and you're going to lose $20,000 this week because of it? Have your free days be free days and not sick days. I mean, there's all these different things you can do when you put data together that I'm just not seeing being done, and it's getting really frustrating. And so whenever I get frustrated, I say, okay, I've got to do this thing where I got trained up on location, and that's one piece of this overall picture, where you are, how you're feeling, what you're doing, how fast you're moving, if you're sad or happy in a specific place. So you can start to get alerts like, hey, you're going to be sad in this place, watch it. Right? Or maybe you should quit your job because a lot of it's like, I did this thing called the Harvard Happiness Project in 2008. And I remember telling people I loved my job, and yet when I was physically there, I reported hating it. And that gave me the courage to quit my job and do full-time on geology. And so, you know, if you had that kind of what Christy Dancy calls perspective as a service, you can actually like use it to rewire your life a bit and get out of those situations where you're getting really compromised. So it's kind of an opposite of the technology that's taking up all of our time, where you start to have like more free time and kind of mindfulness around the technology, and you get to have technology again that's a tool that you use to amplify your life instead of being diminished by it. And I think it's important, and it's kind of a crazy idea, but as somebody who gets anxious around technology and uses it too much, I think it's a reasonable thing to try. So.
Nice. Well, thanks so much, and please give a hand for Amber. And